Leo is popular and well known in astrology as the lion or lioness, the creative, fun-loving sign of good times and happiness. Yet, mastering Leo requires a deep understanding of how our personality is shaped, driven, and sustained by cultural expectations, sibling rivalries, childhood influences, schooling, sports teams, parental influences, and moral standards. Today, we discuss how the ego functions as an intermediary between our subconscious moon energies and the outer world represented by Saturn. We look at how ego is a consciousness in and of itself, and how emotional intelligence is the key that unlocks the Leo vibration. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13 sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior and the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the solar eclipse, where the sun and moon come together in Leo. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There is a lot going on, so let's jump in. Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
I'm excited about this one. If you are like me, who grew up in the 90s in Europe and then moved to New Zealand, I was lucky enough to observe 2 solar eclipses. My first one was in 1999, and the whole pinhole thing through some cardboard, or we had those special glasses, and then I had the same in Wellington, and I can't even remember what year that was, but I think you and I were both living in Wellington then. So we're going to focus on this solar eclipse, and what I find fascinating, we talk about this often, it's not the 12 versus 13 sign astrology, but we look at the world quite differently. And the last time we had a total solar eclipse in this position, so in Leo, was early August 2008. And many people that are listening to this will know that 2008 goes hand in hand with the global financial crisis. And therefore, you and I, we've just spoken about this, that there is probably going to be a lot of astrologers that will talk about it's going to be external events. It's a fire horse year, fire. 12 sign astrologers think that Jupiter is in Leo. So they're going to focus on everything that's happening outside in the big stage. There's a lot of turmoil all across the world. Whereas you and I, we are going to talk about the other side of Leo in a way, because Leo, it's the ego of how we present ourselves. I'm sure you'll really deep dive into how does Leo come into play in the journey of the soul, and especially how does it develop our personality. It starts in the home, and so let's start there. Let's look at it from an individual point of view today. How will this solar eclipse play for each of us?
Yeah, I'm glad you've said that, because it's very easy and interesting and exciting to listen to, particularly those experienced astrologers talking about events in the external world within the context of a fire horse year, with in the 12 sign, of course, Jupiter, as you mentioned, in Leo in the 12 sign, but where is it?
11 degrees Cancer.
So Jupiter's actually in Cancer, which is its most exalted beneficial position, but Cancer is not a fire sign. So we don't have Jupiter in a fire sign, we have Jupiter in a water sign. And, the 2008 event obviously has a lot of parallels and correspondences to today, especially those who believe in the ideas of the fourth turning. We're coming to the end of a big financial cycle, a political cycle, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on the world stage, as you mentioned, that's to do with fire. But while Leo is a fire sign, it's the second of the fire signs, of course, after Mars, Aries, and then Leo, the Sun, and then of course culminating in Sagittarius. And the very simplest interpretation of Leo is that, as you mentioned, this is to do with the journey of the soul through all of the houses. So when we're talking astrology, what we're actually getting at is what do each of those houses, and there's 12 houses, what do they each represent as an experience? That for our soul that's developing and evolving, which house will give us a particular set of experiences, and understanding that and how that informs the development of the soul and the development of the ego and the development of the personality and the mind, the conscious rational mind, understanding what each house, the role that it plays in the development, particularly in this case of the mind, of the mental processes, but also how we express ourselves through the personality, which is very much tied to Leo. That is so important when it comes to understanding how, in fact, we as individuals interact with the world. So, as I say, we make no apology for focusing on the individual side of this rather than the big picture side, because that's where we feel that there's the biggest bang for the buck. So Leo is to do with, in our interpretation, identity, self-awareness, the regard that we have for ourselves, our confident self-expression. I often link Leo to the term or expression confident self-expression. If you think of the sun, Leo, and where the sun is said to sit in the physical body, it's that whole, not just the heart space, but it's kind of the center of our being. So it's very much tied with how we push into the world and how we express ourselves in that context. Our authenticity, our confident self-expression, our personal authority and sovereignty is all linked with Leo as well. But I've heard many interpretations of Leo where they refer to the ego side. So, I've often heard the shadow side of ego is hubris and big ego, and, people who rub others up the wrong way are often assigned or ascribed to having, a strong Leo energy. But I think Leo is a bit more nuanced in that. Certainly the sun lends itself to drama. I mean, we all love the expression, we have at least one drama queen in this house, and you say that often that's linked to Leo, people who are very dramatic in the way that they express themselves. Sometimes OTT or over the top can be very much linked to that sun Leo expression or fire expression in general. But the ego is an interesting one because I don't think too many people really understand what it means. And yet it is juxtaposed and mixed up with the sign of Leo, but also Gemini, Gemini being the rational mind. So I thought what we would do today is, in the context of the astrological mosaic, is just spend a little bit of time looking at what the textbooks say about ego, and then tying that back into the Leo energies as well. So in psychology, the ego is said to be the conscious rational part of the mind that acts as the self or the I. So in the Vedic traditions, we talk about, and I touch on this regularly, that they believe that there are at least 4 levels of mind. 2 of those levels, for example, would be the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. But there are other levels of mind as well. So the ego is the conscious rational part of the mind. And that in and of itself, or that expression infers that the ego therefore has a consciousness of its own. And that's very important. In the Vedic and the older traditions, even older than astrology, they say that, when they divide the mind into those 4 parts, each piece of the mind has its own consciousness, and that's very important to understand. So the unconscious mind, what we assign to the repository of soul, or the moon, which of course plays a massive role at a solar eclipse because it is right alongside the sun, so we can't not talk about the moon either. But if the moon represents the unconsciousness or the unconscious mind, it is in and of itself a consciousness as well. So within us, we have at least 2 levels of consciousness. In fact, there's another level of consciousness, and it's to do with our physical body. So our physical body has a consciousness, or put another way, it has an intelligence. So just there we have 3 levels of mind. We have our conscious mind, our rational thinking mind, which we assign to Mercury and Gemini. We've got the unconscious mind, which we assign to the moon, or what we call the repository of soul, which transcends time and space. And we also have a 3rd level of mind, which of course is our body, which in the astrological mosaic is represented by the earth signs. And this solar eclipse is actually in a trine to Saturn, which is an earth sign. So we have this ego, and this is in the textbooks. They say is this conscious rational part of our mind, what we call the Mercury mind. And the role of the ego as a consciousness within the human vessel is to mediate or balance between the primal urges, the animal instincts of the inner world, which is our subconscious, and then the outer world, which is called the superego in the psychology books, or the superego in very simple terms refers to the morals. So, or put another way, the expectations of us as an individual as we interact with different groups. So there are moral standards that we are to adhere to if we are to continue to operate and function well within these various tribes, and we were touching on some of those earlier. So we have family tribes, and there's a set of morals, or there's a moral compass, or a set of expectations within a family of how to behave. And if we step outside of that, then there are consequences for that. So there's a level of mind there which is external to ourselves, which is actually the mind of morality, the moral mind. And in the psychological study books, in very simple terms, that's called the superego. So we have the ego, we have the superego, which is this external expectations or morals or culture, and we have this internal, what they call in psychology the id, the ID, which is to do with our drives and our urges, and what I call urges and surges, which very much come from the moon part of ourselves. And when we look at, again, when we look at the moon card, we can see that this crustacean is emerging from the waters of unconsciousness, representing the first nascent piece of consciousness. We start to become aware of the fact we actually have all of these different energies within us. And then we have this dog and moon experience, and the dog representing the tamed mind, and the wolf representing the untamed mind. So the ego plays a role in taming the untamed aspects of ourselves. Those deepest, darkest drives, desires and urges, and the parts of us, there's rage there, there's unresolved issues, there's all kinds of stuff, if you like, sitting in our unconsciousness, which we call the moon. So the ego is playing this role that sits over the top of, it's sitting in between, if you like, within us, a consciousness that is reacting to the moral compass or expectations of the tribes within which we interact and operate, and also mediating and suppressing, in most cases, what's within us. because it might not be appropriate to be loud and angry and vengeful in certain settings, and so our ego is suppressing that. But in other settings, and we talked about that before, say in sport, say in physical sports, or any sport where aggression is rewarded, then we are allowing our ego to allow some of that to express itself. All of these different aspects of ego are all tied up with the Leo experience, and this is why I'm just setting the table here. So we've got the ego as this rational conscious mind, which we call the Mercury mind, and it mediates between the consciousness and the unconsciousness, which is the moon energy, the repository of soul. And then the ego is operating and functioning within this broader context of the superego, which is the morality, structures, the cultural expectations of each tribe within which we interact. And there will be family tribes, and there will be sports tribes, and school tribes, and work tribes, and neighborhood tribes, and there's a list that's as long as your arm. So we have to understand those building blocks of ego, which is actually the pieces of the puzzle of Leo, that when we dive into Leo, we're not just talking about the fun and the frivolous side of Leo. We're actually talking about the ego and how it develops within each individual as it moves through houses 1 to 5. And that's where I'd like to sort of set the table for this discussion today, and how important it is to level set about the ego and the superego, or the moral compass or moral expectations on us, and also the primal urges and the animal instincts that we are suppressing mainly within us, because it is inappropriate to express those things in the world.
And we all come from a specific culture as well, right? So I was brought up in Europe. Your childhood was here in New Zealand. And even within Europe, there are so many different cultures that it is, for example, in Greece and in Italy and Spain, it's part of the culture to go to sleep in the afternoon. Whereas here, you don't do that. You are productive in the afternoon and you continue whatever you were doing, whether that is in the workforce or at school. But then, as you were saying, is that the ego helps to contain potential surges. And I see that with my children at school. Sure, they get in trouble sometimes, but they get in trouble more at home. And is that because they know that they shouldn't behave in certain ways at school or at sport or whatever, whereas at home they feel they can, and it's I guess really testing the waters as such. Before I give the mic back to you, for people listening, the chart, we are talking about the August new moon, which is a total solar eclipse here in New Zealand. We can't see this eclipse as it happens at 5:36 in the morning on the 13th of August. And at that time, the sun and moon are conjunct at 1 degree Leo. So what is the next part of this Leo energy, David, that you would like to discuss?
So we're talking about Leo as being the heart of confident self-expression, of personal authority, of sovereignty, of identity, of self-awareness, and our regard for self. And aspects of that Leo energy is obviously, it's layered. And so that in order to feel a sense of identity, or to have an identity, or to feel self-aware or confident or authentic, or express our power and authority, we need to have an idea of what role the ego and the personality are playing, because they're all part of the package. So that's why I've spent some time talking about the ego being the I, the sense of I, who I am. So that I, the Latin translation for I, or the ego, that represents our conscious decision-making self. And so you've just used that example of your kids. they make a conscious or a habitual decision not to break the rules at school. And in fact, that illustrates exactly what we're talking about, where the school has a set of morals and of expectations. And certainly at their school, if they break the rules, what happens is they get issued a yellow card as a warning, or a red card, sort of like the sports idea. But there are consequences for breaking the rules, and therefore the ego reacting to that is looking at that as a consciousness and saying, well, I'm going to choose not to do that because I don't want to deal with the consequences. But in fact, what's happening when you look at the flip side of that is what we're actually doing, what the kids are doing in that scenario, where the ego, and therefore, this is tied up, or the flip side of identity and confident self-expression, is that we're actually choosing not to be punished. So the kids are actually making a conscious choice to say, I don't want that red card, because, and then they link it to a whole bunch of other stuff of ultimately they feel that they've been rejected in some way from the tribe. And the tribe is very important here when we're talking about Leo, because Leo is a pack animal. And also opposite Leo is Aquarius, which is the tribe, the community. So if we understand Leo and how the ego is working to mitigate some of how we express ourselves given different circumstances, then we understand that the ego's role is most of the time, if not always, to find a realistic, safe and socially acceptable way to function. But socially acceptable, really, what does that mean? It means that we fear being shunned or pushed out of the tribe. And so much of our behavior, and therefore our expression, and therefore our sovereignty, and therefore our confidence is tied to not only putting a lid on some of the more aggressive, darker sides of our personality and our inner world. It's also to do with how do I make sure that I position myself socially to ensure that I'm accepted by the tribe, and there are multiple tribes, that I am not seen as, that I'm, put it another way, that I'm seen as, sometimes people want to just fold into the tribe. They don't want to be seen at all. They want to be invisible. And that's what we call the hive mind. So there's a danger here of suppressing even one's ego, which is that confident self-expression, which is this Leo energy, in order to subordinate ourselves to the tribe or the morality. And there are so many examples of this, right? There's the tribes and the morality, not only at school, which I've just used as an example, but there are laws everywhere. Right, we have policemen to enforce those laws, and we have judges and juries to enforce these laws. If you step out of line, you do the crime, you do the time, is one of those expressions. So this idea of Leo's self-expression and authenticity and sovereignty is very tied to our ability to understand the tribe and the context of which we are operating in, and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, but also understand that within us we have certain urges and surges that are desperate to be expressed. And it's very difficult always to be full throttle self-expression or full throttle Leo, because it might not land properly given the circumstances. So if the ego is this mediator, and it's managing, in fact, a conflict between our raw impulses of our, what we call our moon repository, and then there's the strict guilt-driven standards of the superego or the tribe. See, often what people will say is, why didn't you act out in a given situation? Might be at work, or it might be in a sports team, or whatever. Because often they've seen the example of what happens to somebody who steps out of line, and they feel guilty. I know that this won't land with everybody, but certainly an example that comes to mind of this, of a very high profile, was Ben Stokes, the English cricket captain, who, was allegedly stepped outside of the boundaries of what was acceptable within that English cricket team. And, there was all sorts of media and noise and consequences of that. And it turned out that, what his crime was that he, quote unquote, brought the English cricket board into disrepute. So he didn't actually do anything wrong as such, like he was out apparently at a nightclub at 3 a.m. drinking rums for £20 each with his mates. But it wasn't that was the problem. It was that he was the captain of the English cricket team, a very high-profile sports team, and he was supposed to behave at a certain standard, i.e. that was the morality, the external morality which was imposing itself upon him, and he didn't break any rules. He's a grown man, he's allowed to go out at 3 a.m. and drink if he wants to do that, but yet he brought the organisation, this culture was impacted by his behaviour. And this is where we get to the nub of where Leo interacts with Aquarius on the other side. See, many astrologers will only talk about the Leo side, but we also, whenever we're talking about any sign, we have to go to the opposite side and say that's the other side of the coin. So you can see by these stories, as we're beginning to paint the picture of the ego and the personality and confident self-expression and the tribe, and then we have the Saturnian energy, the energy of guilt, of karma, of breaking the rules. If there's an energy that people talk about with Saturn, it's very much that he is the keeper of rules. He is the taskmaster. So we have all of these things in play here. Now, the strength of our ego and how well we can manage and handle all of these competing forces without breaking down or losing touch with reality, that is to do with how aware we are even of the fact that there is an ego. A lot of people don't even understand that. If we're doing a reading, we will spend a lot of time focusing on how they feel, how confident they feel to be their best selves, to express themselves. You remember we did a reading with an older lady who was talking about, she was a Leo. And we were touching on, so the natural state for a Leo is to be effervescent and extroverted and big and loud at its fullest expression. We're talking about the sun. And she said, I don't feel like that. And when we probed and asked about the 3rd and 4th house of experiences, what we talk about, those journeys of the soul, Leo being the 5th house, and we went back to the 3rd and 4th house experiences, the 3rd house of siblings and the 4th house of family, we found that one of the reasons that she wasn't able or didn't feel that she could express her full Leo sun energy was because she had, 12 siblings?
Yeah. Something like that.
Yeah, an enormous number, which in the context, this was sort of a much older lady, but in the context of that was not uncommon in that generation.
Yeah.
But
and the culture that she grew up with, you need to be seen, not heard. Yeah. As well.
So again, a moral expectation being imposed upon that individual was suppressing the Leo energy. You have a son who has a Leo Mars. So we know within him, he has a very forceful masculine energy. But he's got a Aries sister who's also forceful, but a feminine energy. And often we see him pull back and recede from her because she's older but more dominant. But one wonders, of course, as he gets older and physically bigger as well, how much longer that will last. But that, again, is an example of how the sibling rivalries or the 3rd house energies, you can't get to the 5th house energies of the Leo. And so many people focus on the positive But what about if Leo energy is dysfunctional? What if the ego is dysfunctional? What if the personality is not serving somebody? Well, it could be, and often is, to do with their siblings. Or the fourth house, it's to do with the dominant parent, the authority figure. Not necessarily the nurturing parent, but the authority figure. The good cop, bad cop scenario. And you and I do that sometimes with the kids, where I will often play the bad cop and you'll play the good cop. But what that's teaching the kids is that there are good cops and bad cops in all situations and in tribes. There are people who will enforce the rules, and there are people who will not worry about the rules so much. So we've got a lot going on when we talk about the Leo and the energies of the third and the fourth and the fifth house, and also Saturn, which I'm now touching on, and of course the other side of Leo, which is Aquarius.
I love observing how my children are brought up in the same environment, but because of the soul journey they have chosen at this time, they are reacting to certain situations completely different. And for anyone listening, if you have children, I would highly recommend getting their chart done and potentially have a reading just to understand them better and to help them along the way. Like if you know that you have a child that has a lot of empathy, for example, lots of energies in their water signs, then you can just be prepared for that and make sure that they feel safe enough to show those emotions when they come up. And if you have a child that has an Aries sun, that you know to battle that in certain ways and not in others. It's been invaluable in my own way of parenting them both individually and together, understanding what you just mentioned. You know, sure, my boy has that Leo energy, and then his sister has very strong fire energies from the other sign, and just seeing them battle it out at times is interesting. So you've mentioned Saturn already. Again, I find this fascinating that there are so many planets, planetary bodies that we chart, but today what really stood out to both of us is that we had to talk about the solar eclipse, which happens on 1 degree Leo, and they make a trine. So trine is a positive, a constructive aspect with Saturn. Saturn is still sitting in Pisces, in the middle of, because Pisces is one of those signs that is definitely more than 30 degrees. So Saturn is sitting at 22 degrees Pisces. Of course, Saturn, the guardian of Capricorn, you mentioned it's an earth energy, and then Pisces is the third water sign. So how is this trine energy playing out?
Well, the Saturn energy, to get to the Saturn energy, we probably have to take a step back and look at first at the moon energy, because if Saturn represents the lessons to learn, or what I would call ego modification or socialization process through hard lessons, through often going to the bottom of a situation or being reduced to what feels like nothing. Sometimes Saturn can be incredibly harsh as a teacher. These lessons that we're learning in the context of Leo's development of the personality and the ego, but we've skipped over, of course, the fact that we've got the moon energy, which is our internal repository of soul, what the Vedics called the manas. But of course, a lot of these lessons are learned because the ego has failed, as a consciousness, as I set up earlier, the ego has failed to actually put a lid on some of those moon expressions. So in other words, we go back to the moon card, and we've found ourselves acting out, playing out, like we've all seen it, right? We've all done it ourselves. We've all experienced where we've just lost the plot with something. And where the ego just was completely obliterated by this internal, I just feel like, I need to get revenge, or I need to do this, or I'm driven to do that, or, people will go and do things that are crazy and then they won't even remember that they did it. I mean, it's like they almost like get possessed, right? So the ego, very interesting what happens with the ego too, being the rational mind, that puts a lid on this moon repository, which is where these lessons often manifest, can and does get suppressed with alcohol and substances. And so often you feel when you're dealing with, if you're very aware and you're in a party or a social situation, you may see the lid of the ego or the cap of the ego in certain people. You go, oh, I'm really surprised I saw that. That was a really nasty side of that person I just saw. Like, that's because maybe they were drinking, maybe they just felt like cutting loose, maybe they were deeply racist or deeply angry or deeply sad or whatever. There's all sorts of stuff. And so when we talk of Saturn, we have to first acknowledge of Saturn lessons come from a combination of the ego or the rational mind. In other words, we didn't make the right decision in a given set of circumstances. Like, we broke the rules and we consciously did it. But sometimes, and often, this is where the whole idea of I'm a victim of circumstances, or I don't know what happened, I just felt like that was the right thing to do, and then the Saturn energy comes and clips us around the ears, figuratively or literally. But this, in the textbook discussions of the moon repository, is mentioned right at the outset. They call this the id, the ID. And it is the part of us that demands immediate gratification of every urge and wish and desire without delay. Now, as a mother, you will have experienced this with your child crying for milk or food. That need, that urge, which is coming from the unconscious part of, is just, it needs to be satisfied. And if it's not satisfied, then there's a problem. So, it's blind, that id, or that unconscious part of us, and we're talking about the dog and the wolf and that moon card. We're talking about the wolf side of the moon here, is blind to the consequences. So if we respond to and immediately gratify every urge, wish, drive, desire without delay, and we are blind to the consequences, and we set aside our conscious rational mind, our idea of morality, and we operate entirely on raw instinct and passion, then we can get ourselves into all sorts of strife. And that's what that moon card is talking about. And ultimately where Saturn comes in is that there are consequences for that. But part of the energy of the repository of soul, or the moon, is that it contains incredible psychic energies or aggression, of drives. There's a lot of chaos and fantasy in there, and it's a hidden reservoir that's buried deep within our unconsciousness, and it manifests itself in different ways. It can manifest through our body, it can manifest through our emotions, it can manifest psychically and spiritually. So the idea of a hidden reservoir is also important here, because that's the moon, and the moon and Saturn have a very, very interesting relationship. So this moral, ethical and idealistic part of ourselves is balancing this idea of our moral compass and functioning in a way that we don't get pushed out of the tribe, but also what we call our internal conscience, the internal judge. That's part of the Saturn energy. This is the part of ourselves that they say in the textbooks, that the moral compass, or that internal conscious, or what I would say is the beginning stages of Saturn energy within us, begins to form at around apparently ages 3 to 5. And that internal moral compass, or internal conscience, which is an extension of Saturn's lessons, because Saturn is lessons in morality, if it's forming automatically or just spontaneously between the ages of 3 and 5 during childhood, it's happening through the internalization of parental and societal rules. Now, you think about your kids from 3 to 5. They're not thinking about internalizing rules. They're just reacting to. And then what are they reacting to? They're actually reacting to noises and expression and just a feeling. It's like, so this is where this internal judge begins to form very early on. It's not even a mental process, it's actually an emotional reaction. And, so we can then carry these emotional reactions through us for life, and so far as we remain, let's say, scared of an authority figure. And that manifests in the Leo self-expression as a dysfunctional, like that person's very shy or timid. Well, they may have in fact learnt that in childhood. They may have had a very critical or harsh brother or sister. They may have had an overbearing mother or father that really imposed themselves very strongly, and that internal blueprint becomes what we experience externally through Saturn. So Saturn, in a sense, is actually an externalization of a projection that we're making onto the world that's actually come from our own internal experiences at a time where we didn't have any filters. Like a lot of what we think is right or wrong, i.e. the lessons that we submit to and learn, which is Saturn, is actually just an externalization of what we learned in childhood. And I have that expression with Saturn, don't rage against the machine. Well, let's unpack that for a moment as an example here of somebody who rages against the machine. In other words, they're pushing against authority figures, and we have somebody we know that does that, even to the extent where they actually shoot themselves in the foot. They're so determined to rage against the rules or the morality of the system that actually they find themselves excluded from the system. Well, that's Saturn energy playing out in this interaction with this internal drives where the ego hasn't played a role of thinking that's not a good decision, that's not a good idea to do that. We've just allowed this internal stuff to just flow out of us, and some of it's rage. So we have this, as I said, this interaction between our ego or Leo and our personality. We have this internal drives and desires, the requiring and demanding immediate pleasure, this primal scream. And then we have this superego, which is consciousness, which is enforced often. They say that Saturn is institutions, the institutions of power and enforcement. So we think of, you don't pay your taxes, you get in trouble. You break the law, you get in trouble. You break the rules, you get in trouble. That's Saturn. So let's just wrap this up with a couple of practical examples, and I found these on the internet, and they're quite interesting because it ties this all together between how the ego, the morality standards, and the internal moon energies all work together. So imagine walking past a bakery window filled with fresh glazed donuts. The internal side of us, or the moon energy, says, and it's its own consciousness, it demands immediate pleasure. It screams, eat that whole box now because it looks and tastes amazing. The superego, or the morality, or the expectations of the tribe or the community or the society or the nation, it enforces strict moral standards, and we have this internal voice that lectures us when we see this bakery filled with fresh glazed donuts. The superego, or the expectations, the moral expectations are, you are on a health plan and breaking it shows a complete lack of discipline and willpower. We have that conversation. And then the ego steps in as the mediator, and it calculates a realistic compromise. It's its own consciousness. We being I will eat one donut today for afternoon tea, and then I'll walk for an extra 20 minutes this evening to stay on track. Here's another one which is really interesting. Imagine a co-worker takes credit for your hard work during a major team presentation. The internal unconscious drive will react with raw primal aggression. It wants to flip the table, scream at the co-worker and throw a coffee mug. The superego, which is in this context of the work, will be, let's say, the code of conduct. That code of conduct demands flawless, polite behaviour. It whispers to us, stay silent, swallow your anger, don't cause a scene, confronting people is rude. And then we have the ego, which is balancing those two energies. And the ego, which again is this is a running conversation in our mind. That's why we call it the Mercury mind. The ego says, look for a safe, effective solution to this problem. And you're in a guidance system where your mind comes up with the idea of keep your composure during the meeting, but later schedule a private, firm conversation with that co-worker and the manager afterward to clarify the roles. And I'll give one third example of how these all work together. Imagine finding a wallet stuffed with cash on a completely empty park bench. Now, I've done this, so this is why I'm reading this one out. It's quite funny. So the internal drives, the unfiltered part of us will focus purely on self-interest, particularly if you don't have any money. And it will say, take the money, spend it on something fun, no one is watching. The superego, or the moral expectations of that, when you find a wallet stuffed with cash on a completely empty park bench and no one's around, the morality, depending on where you are, in most Western societies anyway, is that if you did take that money in response to this inner drive, you would trigger intense guilt. And so there's a consciousness, a word they call it little devils on the shoulder, that says taking that money is stealing. You are a terrible person if you even think about it. Go find the owner. And often people will run around at great expense to themselves to go find the owner, only to hand it in to the police, and the owner may never be found. But then the ego says, and this is a conversation, the reality of the situation is that you can't keep the money without feeling awful, but you can't stand here forever. So let's look inside for an ID card or hand it into the nearest police station. Now, I have been in this situation, and I have gone through all of those feelings. I was on a walk and I found a wallet, and it didn't have money in it, but it did have ID cards. And I thought to myself, gee, that person had a driver's license. And I thought to myself, oh, it's so difficult to get your driver's license replaced. And what happens if they were wanting to use it and they're looking around? And so I thought, I'm not going to take it to the police station. So what I decided to do, this was my rational mind, my ego, was I just left it where it was. I initially picked it up and put it in my pocket with the idea of trying to find the owner, because I thought, oh, look on Facebook. So I looked on my phone, looked at the ID, couldn't find any social media on this person. So then I turned back around when I was coming back on my walk, because I put it back exactly where I found it. But had there been money in there, let's say there'd been $1,000 in there, I might have rationalized to myself and said, thank you to the universe, I really need that $1,000, so I'll take the money, but just leave the wallet. See, these are the conundrums. And I'm going through this because this is a wrap-up of all that we're talking about. Is the moon is that inner sort of drive, unfiltered part of ourselves. We've got the morality and the rules within which we operate, which is the Saturn energy. And then we've got the Leo energy, which is the ego, which is this rational part of it, which is constantly mediating between the inner, unfiltered part of ourselves, the drives, the desires that require immediate satiation and satisfaction now, versus what is acceptable and what we can get away with, which is the Saturn energy. But the degree to which our Leo ego or energy is developed will determine the direction that we take in those different scenarios. The situation at work, the situation with the overeating, the situation with finding a wallet with money or ID. There's just example after example after example. The point here is that Leo is actually an incredibly nuanced, complex sign. And it is so important to understand that actually, if we work on developing our ego, which is the message of the solar eclipse, this is a super duper powerful message from the universe that says work on developing a strong, robust and realistic mind, mental energy, so that when you're confronted with these moral dilemmas, when you're confronted with these crossroads, when you're confronted with these inflection points, these choice points, you're going to make what you believe to be the best decision possible. And if you do that most of the time, then you will be able to express your Leo authenticity, your Leo confidence, your Leo strong and robust and powerful self-expression, because you've thought about developing your ego, which is actually a mechanism of thought. It's actually a mechanism of assessing and evaluating and weighing the whole time what do I feel and what do I think is the right thing to do. And then assessing, like your kids at school, I'm not going to step out of line because I don't want the red card. In other words, I don't want the punishment. I'd rather the pleasure and the upside, which is it's better to be part of the tribe in that situation. But equally, there's the other side of it. Sometimes that compliance isn't the right thing to do. And that's also part of our ego. And we make a rational evaluation that says, actually, I'm going to push back here, because if it wasn't for the rule breakers, if it wasn't for the innovators, if it wasn't for those that operate at the boundary of experiences or the boundary of ego, then we would never have the Leo going into the opposite sign of Aquarius, who are the rule breakers. See, often I would argue that the best rule breakers are those that understand what they can get away with. And to me, that's to do with a strong ego. So in other words, a refined Leo expression is actually what supports innovation and change and radical movements in political systems and social systems and so on and so forth. So that's it for me, I think. I think we've covered all the bases.
I really like that we took quite a different stance today about understanding such an important part of us individually. We all have an ego, and how do we have that person, let's call it a person, the person in the middle, and constantly weighing up what are the benefits of going one way or another way. So hopefully the people listening are taking that message away and applying it in their own lives. So where does your Leo sit is my question to you. Thank you so much, David, for this deep dive. I look forward to seeing the comments on our podcast episodes. And if you want to get in touch for your own chat, please do so. Until next time, really.
Yeah, namaste.
Namihi.